I've been buying organic corn for several years, but I feel in the last few months that I'm losing confidence that it's possible to have corn that isn't corrupted by GMOs now.
So organic products are not allowed to intentionally use GMOs. The pollen does not read the sign. Sometimes the organic grower will buy seeds that are already contaminated, or they'll plant their corn next to GM corn and not have sufficient buffer zone, or corn plant can fly for miles actually. So it's not possible to be 100% sure that a corn product is non-GMO. But we still recommend organic as one of the tools, one of the tips to avoid GMOs. If it's contaminated, it's probably a tiny percentage. But organic products do not require the testing of GMOs to see if it's contaminated or how much. So there is a third-party verifier called the Non-GMO Project, which we highly recommend. There are over 5,500 products that have been enrolled in this new system. In order for a product to be listed on a shopping guide, it must be enrolled. So if you see a product that is labeled as Non-GMO Project Verified, it means that it's designed in a system to meet the standards. Even then, you can't guarantee 100% absence of GMOs. They have an action threshold that's quite low, but you can't be 100% sure. And if you see something that's organic and Non-GMO Project Verified, that's like the gold standard, because it follows both standards. So we look at the 4 main tips to avoid GMOs: by organic, by products that say non-GMO, by products in our shopping guide. And then the other one is to avoid the at-risk ingredients. Avoid anything derived from corn or soy or cottonseed or canola or sugar beets or the microorganisms that produce aspartame. And these derivatives are listed in our guide. And some are always produced from a GMO, and sometimes they're produced. So it's hard to know the level of risk because there's too many unknowns.
You had said that if these large companies like McDonald's saw a 5% drop in the basically market share of GMO products, that you think they'd be convinced to drop it. But you said in Europe that they have dropped it already because there was less of a demand. I'm curious if you know what percentage of a drop there was in Europe that caused them to stop selling GMO products.
Well, when I say a drop in market share, it's not a 5% drop in market share that I think will do it. It's 5% of U.S. shoppers avoiding GMOs. I think the actual drop in market share that will cause it will be a lot less than 5%. Some of those people who would be in that 5% will never eat at McDonald's anyway, and they're not going to notice it. But I think when you get 15 million Americans avoiding brands that contain GMOs, then you're going to start seeing some of the major brands having a drop in market share. The kick-out in Europe happened in 10 weeks from the time the gag order was lifted. And it happened because of the sentiment that was now popular throughout Europe that GMOs are unsafe. So there actually wasn't a drop in market share at all. There was a changed perception, and the companies realized they better get on board. At that point, no one was offering non-GM products except one small chain in the UK. Everyone else was not paying attention. But as soon as it hit the fan, then they realized they had to remove it.
So there doesn't seem to be too many human studies going on. Why are there not too many epidemiological studies? Does the industry really have that much sway over the funding?
Yeah, you answered your question. They have basically nearly 100% control. They don't actually release seeds for testing. They have a patent over the seeds and the crops, so they're typically disallow independent research. 26 entomologists and environmental scientists wrote a letter, an open letter. They hid their names, but they wrote a letter to the EPA saying there's no independent studies going on because we're not allowed to have access to the patented seeds to do the studies. And if they completely control who does it and what's reported, they get a chance to review it and just determine what data gets released. If studies are done by independent scientists, they're attacked viciously. And Ignacio Chapela said, that this has caused it to be very difficult to get anyone to do research in this field. One senior scientist I know said he knows dozens of scientists that refuse to do any more research in these fields because they don't want to sustain the attacks on themselves and their families.
So there could be a time, 5, 10, 15 years, when people just do not grow or eat corn anymore because there'd be too much risk that those, is that, and wheat and sugar, is that a possibility? Like there'd be a, no more polar bears and no more corn?
Yes, there is a possibility. Here's an example. India was going to introduce BT eggplant. Hardly any studies on the safety. They've got thousands of varieties of eggplant. Eggplant cross-pollinates. Monsanto wanted their BT eggplant approved. Well, there was an uprising against the BT eggplant, and it got stopped. What if it didn't get stopped? What if it was introduced, started to cross-pollinate, and then 10 years down the road, they discovered that the BT toxin was turning our intestinal flora into living pesticide factories or causing some problem? By that time, the cross-pollination might have gone so wild and so free that every eggplant in the country was suspect. What are you going to do? You're going to say, if you have any eggplant, it may be causing this new disease. Same with the corn, same with the soy. So if it turns out that it's officially discovered that there's a disease or disorder as a result of a particular crop, you might lose the crop as a whole. Now with corn, you can actually, there are seed companies with pure, non-GMO corn. I know some of them tested, and it's absolutely pure, and their whole system of growing it out is completely secure. So you could eliminate a lot of corn and grow this pure seed in isolated areas without contamination and reintroduce corn. But you end up, if you put it on the same field where the GM corn was grown, you have to eliminate the volunteer kernels that have fallen into the ground that may germinate after a year or two. And so you have contamination that occurs through the same field year after year. Then you have the combine equipment that harvests it, so you can end up with corn kernels in there. Or the storage bins, or the trucks, or the barges, or the ships. Throughout the grain chain, you can end up contaminating non-GM with GM. So this is what companies have to deal with when they're going for a non-GM product.
So you mentioned that that a potential danger is transfer into gut microbiota, genes into gut microbiota, but I'm a little confused about how that might happen and why you aren't concerned that any gene from anything that you're consuming can be transferred over. Why exactly do you think those particular genes will transfer into gut microbiota?
I'm so glad you asked that question. I love this question. Plant genes don't typically transfer to gut bacteria, and if they do, they wouldn't necessarily express themselves. Bacteria swaps genes all the time. That's part of what they do. But in order to swap it, they need something called homology or similarity. But the sequences in plants are quite different than the sequences in bacteria. So the chances of the plant genes transferring to bacterial genes are much, much less. They're also longer. So the chances of it transferring are less. But the genes inserted into most GM crops are from bacteria, not plants. So now the food that we eat contains bacterial genes that have the similarity and the length that are likely sufficient to transfer. If plant genes transfer, there's two good reasons why they probably would not express protein in bacteria. The first is that the on switch, called the promoter, does not work in bacteria. But in the GM crops, they use a promoter typically from the cauliflower mosaic virus, which does work in bacteria. And when the genes transferred to gut bacteria in humans, it also transferred with the promoter. The second reason why plant genes wouldn't necessarily express themselves is that higher organisms within the gene have coding portions and non-coding portions, the codons and the introns. And when they get pushed into the RNA phase, the little mechanical men inside the cells remove the introns and recombine the RNA. So that's how you can produce many different proteins from a single gene. They just splice and dice. But bacteria does not contain introns. So if a large gene from plants got put into a bacterium and it has introns, the people with the clipboards inside the bacteria say, I don't know what to do. They wouldn't know what to do with it. But the bacterial genes that are put into the GM crops have no introns, or at least not in the coding portion. So that means that they don't have that problem. So these are four barriers: similarity, length, promoter, introns. Four barriers that normally eliminate the possibility or minimize it dramatically that plant genes will colonize gut bacteria. All four of those are dismantled with GMOs, suggesting we might be colonizing the gut bacteria of North Americans. So it's a huge problem that needs to be evaluated. And we don't know if it's the case. We just know that the science theory supports such a horrible thing.
In terms of like monocultures, and I guess like yellow corn is the most widely used, I believe, right? Yellow corn?
Of corn.
Of corn.
Yeah. By the way, if you're leaving and you would like to pick up a shopping guide, don't feel you're rude to go back. You can buy stuff back there, get a shopping guide for free, get a health risk brochure for free.